Steve Harvey had been hosting Family Feud for over 15 years, and throughout that extensive tenure, he had become remarkably skilled at reading people and anticipating the kinds of stories contestants might share. He had heard countless anecdotes about how couples met, how families were formed, and the various traditions and choices that shaped different households. However, his experience had also taught him that every so often, a contestant would share something completely unexpected, a revelation that would shift the entire atmosphere of the studio, and remind him that behind every family standing on his stage were complex human stories involving joy, pain, struggle, and resilience. What transpired on that autumn afternoon in October 2024 would challenge his assumptions about marriage, identity, and the lasting impact of trauma in ways he had never anticipated during his years in entertainment. Before examining this profound moment in detail, if you value stories that explore the complex reasons behind personal choices and demonstrate the importance of understanding rather than judging, please take a moment to engage with this content by liking and subscribing to our channel. We share narratives that illuminate the depth of human experience and remind us that every choice, even those that seem simple on the surface, often carries significant meaning and history. The Anderson family from Portland, Oregon stood ready to compete against the Chen family from Miami, Florida. The Anderson family consisted of 45-year-old David Anderson, his wife Katherine, who was 43, their two adult children, and David's sister. During the standard pre-game introductions, where Steve typically engaged in light-hearted conversation to help audiences connect with the contestants, he noticed something unusual on the family information card the producers had prepared. The card listed Katherine's last name as Mitchell rather than Anderson, despite her being introduced as David's wife of 22 years. Steve, whose natural curiosity and conversational style had made him beloved by audiences, asked Katherine about this detail in his characteristic friendly manner. He inquired whether she had kept her maiden name when she married David, noting that while this choice was increasingly common, it was still relatively unusual among couples of their generation who had married in the early 2000s. He posed the question with the expectation that Katherine would provide one of the typical explanations he had heard before: professional reasons related to an established career, family heritage considerations, or perhaps feminist principles about maintaining one's identity independent of marriage. Katherine paused for a moment, glancing at David, who nodded encouragingly and squeezed her hand in a gesture that clearly communicated support and solidarity. She took a visible breath and explained that the reason she had never taken David's last name was not related to career or principle, but rather stemmed from her experience in a previous marriage that had ended in ways that made the idea of changing her name unbearable. Steve's expression shifted slightly, sensing that this explanation would be more substantial than the simple answer he had anticipated, and he gently encouraged her to share what she felt comfortable revealing. Katherine explained that before she met David, she had been married to a man named Robert Anderson. The marriage had begun with what seemed like love and promise, but had deteriorated over 7 years into a relationship characterized by control, manipulation, and eventually physical violence. She described how Robert had insisted she take his last name immediately upon marriage, presenting it as a romantic gesture of unity and commitment. At the time, young and in love, she had willingly changed her name from Katherine Mitchell to Katherine Anderson, believing it symbolized the beginning of their shared life together. However, as the marriage progressed and Robert's behavior became increasingly controlling and abusive, Katherine came to associate the name Anderson with a period of her life marked by fear, diminished self-worth, and loss of personal identity. She explained that Robert had used her married name as a tool of control, frequently reminding her that she was Mrs. Anderson and therefore belonged to him, that her identity was subsumed within his, and that she had no individual existence separate from her role as his wife. The name became, in her experience, a symbol of ownership rather than partnership, a marker of the erasure of her individual self. When Katherine finally found the courage and opportunity to leave the abusive marriage, one of her first actions after ensuring her physical safety was to legally change her name back to Katherine Mitchell. She described this name change as a crucial part of reclaiming her identity and sense of self after years of being defined entirely through her relationship with someone who had harmed her. The process of signing documents with her original name again had felt like a profound act of self-recovery, a declaration that she existed as an individual person with worth and identity independent of any man or any marriage. Several years after her divorce and extensive therapy to process the trauma of her abusive marriage, Katherine met David Anderson. The fact that he shared the same last name as her abusive ex-husband was initially a source of considerable anxiety for her. She described how hearing the name Anderson again, after working so hard to reclaim her identity, as Mitchell had triggered powerful emotional responses connected to her previous trauma. However, David as a person was so fundamentally different from Robert, so respectful and kind and supportive, that she had been able to separate the man from the name and develop a healthy relationship that eventually led to marriage. When David proposed and they began planning their wedding, the question of whether Katherine would take his last name arose naturally. Katherine explained that she had been honest with David about her history and about the complex emotions she carried regarding the name Anderson. She told him that while she loved him deeply and wanted to marry him, the idea of becoming Katherine Anderson again felt psychologically unbearable, like voluntarily returning to an identity associated with the worst period of her life. She said that even though she knew intellectually that David was nothing like Robert, the emotional and psychological associations with that name combination remained powerful and triggering. What happened next in Katherine's story was what had prompted David's supportive hand squeeze during her revelation to Steve and the audience. David, upon hearing Katherine's explanation of why she could not take his name, had responded with immediate understanding and support. He told her that her well-being and psychological health were infinitely more important than any tradition or convention about married names. He explained that he loved Katherine Mitchell, that the name she called herself had no bearing on the reality of their commitment to each other, and that he would never ask her to do something that caused her pain or triggered trauma for the sake of social convention. David had gone further, offering to change his own last name to Mitchell so they could share a name without requiring Katherine to adopt the name Anderson. Katherine had been deeply moved by this offer, but had declined, explaining that she did not need them to have the same last name to feel married and committed. She said that what mattered was the respect and understanding David showed by prioritizing her emotional needs over traditional expectations. They had married with Katherine keeping the name Mitchell, and over their 22 years together, the different surnames had never been a source of conflict or confusion, merely a reflection of Katherine's journey and David's respect for that journey. As Katherine finished explaining this history, the studio had fallen into profound silence. Steve Harvey stood completely still at his podium, his usual animated expression replaced by something much more contemplative and moved. His eyes had filled with tears that he made no attempt to hide, and for several long moments he did not speak, simply processing what he had heard and allowing the weight of Katherine's story to settle over the studio. The audience remained equally quiet, clearly affected by the vulnerability and honesty Katherine had demonstrated in sharing such personal and painful history. When Steve finally found his voice, it was thick with emotion and noticeably softer than his typical energetic hosting tone. He addressed Katherine directly, thanking her for her courage in sharing something so deeply personal on national television. He acknowledged that what she had described was far more than a simple explanation about name choice, but rather a window into survival, recovery, and the long-lasting impacts of abuse even after the abusive relationship had ended. He told her that her willingness to be vulnerable about her experience honored everyone who had survived similar circumstances and helped create understanding about why choices that might seem unusual to outsiders often carried profound meaning for the people making them. Steve then turned to address David, his voice carrying unmistakable respect and admiration. He told David that his response to Katherine's needs regarding her name demonstrated the kind of mature, selfless love that characterized truly healthy marriages. He explained that many men would have felt entitled to have their wife take their name regardless of her reasons for hesitation, would have interpreted her choice as a rejection or lack of commitment, or would have made their own feelings of pride or tradition more important than their partner's psychological well-being. David's immediate prioritization of Katherine's healing and comfort over his own potential preferences about names reflected the fundamental respect that distinguished partnership from ownership. Steve spoke about how Katherine and David's story illustrated important truths about marriage and relationships that often went unspoken. He explained that real commitment was not demonstrated through surface markers like shared names or traditional gender roles, but rather through the daily choices partners made to honor each other's needs, to support each other's healing, and to create space for each person to maintain their individual identity within the partnership. He said that David's offer to change his own name, while ultimately declined, represented the kind of creative problem-solving and genuine care that sustained marriages through difficulties and changes. The host also addressed the broader audience, both in the studio and watching at home, about the lasting impacts of abusive relationships. He explained that trauma did not simply disappear when someone left an abusive situation, but rather could continue affecting survivors for years or even decades afterward. He said that understanding this reality required people to extend grace and flexibility to survivors making choices that might not align with conventional expectations. He emphasized that what might seem like a small or insignificant tradition to someone who had never experienced abuse could carry enormous psychological weight for someone whose trauma was connected to that tradition. Steve made the decision to pause filming briefly before continuing with the game, explaining that Katherine's revelation had shifted the energy in a way that needed to be acknowledged rather than immediately glossed over in service of entertainment. He invited Katherine and David to step aside with him for a private conversation off camera, wanting to ensure Katherine felt comfortable continuing with the competition and had not been pressured to share more than she intended or to reveal details that might cause her distress upon reflection. During this private conversation, which production staff would later describe as deeply moving, Katherine assured Steve that she had chosen deliberately to share her story when he asked about her name. She explained that she had spent many years working through shame about her experience of abuse, but had reached a place in her healing where she could speak about it openly without being defined or diminished by it. She said that if sharing her story helped even one person understand why abuse survivors might make choices that seemed unusual, or helped one survivor feel less alone in carrying the long-term impacts of their trauma, then the vulnerability of public disclosure was worthwhile. David added that he and Katherine had discussed the possibility that the name difference would be noticed and questioned during their appearance on the show, and they had agreed together that Katherine would answer honestly if asked. He said that they both believed there was value in normalizing conversations about domestic violence and its lasting effects, and that Katherine's experience and recovery could serve as testimony that healing was possible and that healthy relationships could exist after abusive ones. When filming resumed and the game continued, there was a noticeable shift in how the audience and even the opposing family interacted with the Andersons. The competitive energy was still present, but was tempered with a quality of respect and support that reflected the emotional depth of what had been shared. When Katherine provided answers during the game, the audience cheered with particular enthusiasm, as though celebrating not just her game show performance but her broader courage and resilience. When the Anderson family ultimately won their rounds and advanced to the final round, the studio celebration felt like acknowledgement of more than just game show success. The family went on to win a substantial cash prize in the final round, and Steve made a point during the celebration to reference Katherine's story again. He told her that while the money was wonderful and would hopefully be useful to the family, what she had won through her courage in sharing her experience was the opportunity to help countless other people understand abuse, recovery, and the complexity of choices that survivors made in rebuilding their lives. He said that her testimony about David's response to her needs also provided a model for what supportive partnership looked like in practice rather than merely in principle. When the episode aired 3 months later, the network included a content advisory at the beginning warning viewers that the episode contained discussion of domestic violence and providing information about resources available to people experiencing abuse. They made this decision not to sensationalize the content, but rather to prepare viewers appropriately, and to ensure that anyone who might be triggered by discussion of domestic violence could make an informed choice about whether to watch. The response to the episode was immediate and profound. Social media platforms were flooded with reactions from viewers who had been moved by Katherine's story and by the visible respect and support demonstrated by both David and Steve. Thousands of people shared their own experiences of leaving abusive relationships and the various ways that trauma from those relationships continued to affect their lives years or even decades later. Many specifically discussed how they had made choices about names, living situations, career paths, or other aspects of their lives based on associations with their trauma, and how they had often felt judged or misunderstood by people who could not comprehend why certain seemingly small things carried such enormous emotional weight. Domestic violence organizations reported that the episode had sparked important conversations about the long-term impacts of abuse and the various forms that trauma recovery could take. Advocates noted that popular culture often portrayed leaving an abusive relationship as the end of the story, with insufficient attention paid to the complex healing process that followed and the various ways that past trauma could continue affecting survivors' present lives. Katherine's openness about why she kept her maiden name provided a concrete example of how trauma shaped choices in ways that might not be immediately obvious to outside observers. The episode also generated discussion about names and marriage more broadly, with many viewers reflecting on the assumptions and expectations surrounding married names. Some people shared that they had never really considered why women taking their husbands' names was treated as default or expected, or how that tradition might feel different to someone whose experience of taking a particular name had been connected to abuse and control. Others discussed how they had judged women who kept their maiden names, assuming the choice reflected lack of commitment or problematic feminist ideology, without considering that individual circumstances and histories might inform these deeply personal decisions. David and Katherine received numerous messages from couples thanking them for modeling what supportive partnership looked like in practice. Many people specifically referenced David's immediate acceptance of Katherine's needs regarding her name and his offer to change his own name as examples of the kind of flexibility and prioritization of partners' well-being that characterized healthy relationships. Some men shared that watching David's response had prompted them to reflect on their own attitudes about names and tradition, recognizing that they had held expectations they had never examined or questioned. Katherine became an accidental advocate for domestic violence survivors, invited to share her story at various events focused on supporting people experiencing or recovering from abusive relationships. She spoke about the importance of understanding that recovery was not linear or simple, that survivors might continue processing their trauma and its impacts for many years after leaving dangerous situations. She emphasized that support for survivors needed to extend beyond the immediate crisis of escape to encompass the longer-term work of rebuilding identity, processing complex emotions, and learning to trust again. She also spoke specifically about how David's response to her needs had been crucial in her ability to enter and sustain a healthy relationship after her abusive marriage. She explained that if David had been insistent about the name change, had made her feel guilty about her choice, or had interpreted her decision as a reflection on him rather than on her trauma, she likely would not have been able to continue the relationship. His immediate understanding and creative problem-solving had demonstrated that he was someone who could hold space for her healing rather than requiring her to hide or minimize her trauma for his comfort. Steve Harvey continued to reference Katherine and David's story in subsequent interviews and public appearances. He spoke about how the encounter had deepened his understanding of domestic violence and its lasting impacts. He acknowledged that before hearing Katherine's explanation, he might have made assumptions about why she had kept her maiden name, assumptions that would have missed the profound truth of her actual experience. He said that her willingness to educate him and the audience had been a gift that helped create greater empathy and understanding. The incident also prompted reflection within the Family Feud production team about the kinds of questions they asked contestants and the ways they prepared for potentially sensitive revelations. The team recognized that asking about personal choices like names, living arrangements, career paths, or family structures could sometimes open conversations about trauma, loss, or other difficult experiences. They developed protocols for supporting contestants who shared painful histories, and for ensuring that such revelations were handled with appropriate sensitivity, both during filming and in the editing and presentation of final episodes. Several years after the episode aired, Katherine and David's story remained a cultural reference point in discussions about domestic violence recovery, the lasting impacts of trauma, and the importance of respecting survivors' choices even when those choices did not align with conventional expectations. The phrase, "pulling a David Anderson," emerged in some communities as shorthand for prioritizing a partner's healing and well-being over tradition or convention, reflecting the positive example his response had provided. Katherine reported in later interviews that sharing her story on national television had been simultaneously terrifying and liberating. She said that making her trauma and its ongoing impacts visible had helped her release remaining shame she had carried about her experience. She noted that the overwhelmingly supportive response from viewers had reinforced what she had learned in therapy, but sometimes still struggled to fully internalize. That abuse was not the fault of the person experiencing it, and that the choices survivors made in their healing deserved respect rather than judgment. The lasting impact of Katherine's revelation extended beyond individual awareness to influence how domestic violence was discussed in various contexts. Therapists incorporated the story into their work with clients recovering from abusive relationships, using it to illustrate how trauma could affect seemingly unrelated aspects of life and how healing partners responded to disclosure of past abuse. Educators used it in training programs for professionals who worked with domestic violence survivors, demonstrating the importance of understanding that recovery was complex and that choices survivors made often carried meanings that might not be immediately apparent. If this examination of trauma, recovery, and the importance of understanding the complexity behind personal choices has provided meaningful perspective, please support our channel by engaging with this content through likes and subscriptions. Share this story with others who might benefit from understanding how past trauma shapes present choices, or who might need the reminder that supportive partnership involves honoring a loved one's healing even when it requires departing from tradition or convention. In a society that often privileges conformity to social expectations over individual well-being, let us remember that the most meaningful traditions are those that serve people rather than requiring people to sacrifice their healing and comfort in service of convention. Steve Harvey's visible emotion and respectful response to Katherine's revelation remains a powerful example of how creating space for authentic stories and honoring the complexity of human experience can transform a simple entertainment program into an opportunity for profound education and connection.